Good evening to everybody in China. Good morning to Professor Christakis. Thank you for joining us. Good to see everybody. My name is Devin Lau, and I'm the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. By way of quick introduction, Yale Center Beijing was founded in 2014 as a way to bring the best of Yale to China. It's Yale's first and only university-wide center to be located outside of New Haven. And we are especially delighted that even now during a time of a global pandemic, we're still able to showcase the best that Yale has to offer to China. And so we're gonna get started real soon. I just wanted to go over the format real quick. We're gonna do a quick talk of about 30 to 40 minutes from Professor Christakis, and then we'll open it up to questions. And so please feel free to get those questions ready as you listen to the talk. Today, we're also working with Cheers Publishing in China to be able to offer a copy of Blueprint in Chinese to the first two people who ask a question about the talk today. So thank you to Cheers Publishing as well for working with us to offer those two free books for the Q&A session. Take the time to introduce Professor Christakis. He is Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science, and he's appointed in many departments, the Department of Sociology, Medicine, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, Biomedical Engineering, as well as the School of Management. And so as you can tell from his very broad range of interests and expertise, he is a true Yaley at heart. He received his bachelor's from Yale, an MD and MPH from Harvard, as well as a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. As a social scientist and physician at Yale, he conducts research in the fields of network science, biological, biosocial science, as well as behavioral genetics. And his current work focuses on the interaction between human biology and health and how they are affected and affect social interactions and social networks. He's the director of the Human Nature Lab, as well as the co-director of the Yale Institute for Network Science. He's been named to many lists, including Time's 100 Most Influential Thinkers, as well as Foreign Policy Magazine's similar list. And he's the author of over 200 articles and several books, including the aforementioned Blueprint, as well as his influential book, Connected, The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives. And so today he's going to be talking to us about his most recent book, which was just published in English, I guess about a month or two ago, Apollo's Arrow, talking about how the current pandemic that we're all in has affected the way we interact with each other and with society. And so we are absolutely delighted to have him join us today. For those of you guys that are willing and able, I would suggest turning on your cameras just so that we can have a little bit more of an actual conversation here and not just have Professor Christakis feel like he's talking to a blank screen. So that would be appreciated if you'd be able to do that, and especially when we go into the Q&A session. And so thank you again for joining us. It's nice and early here for us in New Haven, and I'm excited to hear what you have to share.
Well, thank you, Devin. Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you all. I've been to China many times, not recently. One of my favorite experiences was taking the cross-country train from Xi'an, where we had gone to see the terracotta warriors, to Hohhot in Inner Mongolia, which was about 24 hours on an old-fashioned Chinese train, and that was quite an experience for us. I have to say.
Quite the trip, yeah.
Yes, it's quite a trip. It's not on the fast modern train. It's an old style, and we also I wish I could speak Chinese and speak to you in this language, but I speak other languages, but not Chinese. So I'm sorry about that. Devin mentioned Blueprint, which has been translated into Chinese, but Apollo's Arrow will also be appearing in Chinese before long. It just came out in English and it'll be out soon in translation. Because Devin mentioned Blueprint, let me just say something about that at the beginning and then try to connect the books a little bit. So I'm a scientist is my primary identity, and I run a laboratory, and we have many divisions in my lab. We investigate the biology and genetics of human social interaction. We do work on artificial intelligence and how that affects social interaction. We do public health trials, randomized controlled trials in developing world settings. We do lots and lots of different things. But every 10 years or so, I also write a book. And Blueprint took about 10 years, and I published it about a year ago. And I was working on the next book, which was going to come in another 10 years. And I interrupted that to write Apollo Zero in like 4 months. And I want to tell you a little bit about why. So first, the basic idea in Blueprint, and the subtitle for that is The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, is that a natural selection has shaped not just the structure and function of our bodies. Our bodies, obviously, their anatomy and their physiology has been shaped by our evolution. And natural selection has also shaped the structure and function of our minds. How we think, the kind of biases we have, the kind of people we are, depends on our evolutionary past. But natural selection has also shaped the structure and function of our societies. So many of the intrinsic properties of society, for example, our capacity for love, or our capacity for friendship, the fact that we form friendships, you all take this for granted, but this is actually a very unusual feature. Other animals do not form long-term, non-reproductive unions to members of their species, but we do. We do it, elephants do it, certain other primates do it, dolphins and whales do it, and that's pretty much it, actually. And all those animals independently evolve the capacity for friendship. And we also do other things, like we cooperate. We help strangers who are unrelated to us. This doesn't happen in other animals, but we do it also. So we have all these qualities you see, love and friendship and cooperation and teaching. We teach each other things. This is astonishing. It's extremely rare in the animal kingdom that one animal will pay a price, expend time to teach another animal something. So Blueprint was about our innate social order. The fact that the way we organize ourselves has certain fundamental, enduring, universal features. Well, what happened in the time of the pandemic? All those features were put under pressure. And so it was very interesting to me to see the ways in which, in some sense, the great force of a deadly germ was meeting the enduring reality of our evolved social nature, right? We have this way of living, and then bang, this deadly germ is affecting it. So I had, obviously, as Devin said, I'm also a physician. I had spent many years as a hospice doctor, taking care of people who are dying. And I had been studying epidemics and contagion and social contagion, as Devin mentioned, with another book and other work that we'd done. So I thought it was a good opportunity. Plus, I was stuck at home, like all of you were, beginning in January 24th. I was, going a little bit crazy. So I figured, okay, what can I do? I think I'll write a book about the pandemic. And that's why you have this thing now already. All right, let me tell you. Oh, and let me tell you one other thing, and then I'll say a few remarks, and we can have some questions. I have for a very long time had a group of Chinese scientists that I collaborate with, based in Hong Kong primarily. Jianmen Jia and Jason Jia. Jason was a Yale alum, and also Xin Lu. And then and we had been working on using phone data from China to sort of a big data project to understand features of human social organization. So for example, we had records of using anonymized phone data. Obviously, we don't know who the people are, and we weren't listening to their conversations. We just know who was calling who. We could map the social networks, and we knew where the pings were, where the phones were. And we used this data after the Chinese earthquake from, what was it, 10 or 15 years ago, to study when you have this sudden stress from an earthquake, who do people call? How does the earthquake change social organization? and how does social organization, how does your social network affect your ability to cope with the shock of an earthquake? And so we've been using the data to do some projects. In fact, that paper was just accepted now, years later. And we'd also been using the data to study economic development. So for example, when China builds a high-speed rail line between two cities, it makes certain social interactions easier. Does that affect economic development along the corridor or not? So we had this prior collaboration my laboratory did with these Chinese laboratories. And when coronavirus struck well, obviously at the end of 2019, but in particular by January of 2020, my colleagues called me up and they said, look, we have these data, we should study what's happening with the pandemic. And so we began a project in the middle of January to study the coronavirus. And we had data, for example, on the movement of people through Wuhan from January 1st to January 24th. We had information on 11 million people transiting through Wuhan and spreading out through all of China. And then we got from the Chinese CDC, we got coronavirus cases as they were occurring throughout the rest of the country. And we were able to show in a paper that was published in Nature in April that the movement of people perfectly predicted the timing, location, and intensity of the pandemic throughout the rest of China through the end of February. And it was very exciting for me because of course you guys are on the other side of the world. I would work all day and send it to my Chinese colleagues. They would then work all their day and send it back to me. When I went to sleep, I woke up. It was being a bit like being a young graduate student again. We weren't sleeping. We were working nonstop. We started working on the project sort of the third week in January. We submitted it on February the 18th. We submitted the paper to the journal, and it was accepted and published, in April. But the point was, because of that collaboration, I was paying very careful attention to what was happening in China. Therefore, on January 24th, when your government promulgated orders, that closed off management orders that basically put 930 million Chinese in some form of home confinement on January 24th. And that really got my attention. I mean, the Chinese people, and certainly the Chinese government, had determined that this virus was sufficiently serious that they put 1 billion people at home. It was like detonating a social nuclear weapon, right? That's how they said, oh my God, this is really a strong threat. And so when that happened, I decided to turn about half of my laboratory's attention over to the virus. And then by the end of February, I had turned like all of my laboratory's attention over to the virus, because it was very clear to me that this was going to be a serious global pandemic, once in a century event. Now, the Chinese, of course, have done exceptionally well in coping with the virus. But, you have an authoritarian government and you have a collectivist culture. So you had certain strengths that made it easier for you in some ways to cope with the virus. But in the United States has its own strengths. We're a very rich country. We have very open communication. So, some of the issues at the beginning that happened in China where information was suppressed, I thought would not occur in the United States. But of course, they did occur in the United States. We had a government that, was, not being honest with the people about what was happening. And as I talk about in the book, there was an equal temptation to suppress information here. Nevertheless, we had certain strengths in the United States: our scientists, our wealth, our openness, which we could have deployed, I think, better in our fight against the virus. And we have not done so well, in my view, against the virus. So let me just say a few things about the virus. Now, many of you probably know I had a Chinese graduate student, and she very kindly took a copy of my book back to Wuhan and photographed it at the Huanan Seafood Market, which is one of my most precious possessions now, a copy of Apollo's Arrow back where the where the story begins. So you're probably familiar with lots of these things, but let me just summarize a couple of basic pieces of information and then share with you a few observations about pandemics in general, and then open it up for some questions. So what you have to understand is that something very unusual has happened to us in the life of our species. We happen to be alive when a new serious global pathogen has been introduced into our species. And this virus is now going to circulate among us forever. This virus is never going to go away. If, in fact, there were no vaccine technology available, it would not be clear that the Chinese response was the right response, because the virus has not been eradicated. The virus is still there and will come back. So if, in fact, there was no vaccine available, all China would have done is postpone the inevitable, which is the affliction of the population. It's the fact that we happen to be alive in the 21st century at a moment when this pandemic struck, as previous pandemics have struck for hundreds or thousands of years. We were alive at a moment when we could develop a countermeasure, a vaccine. And that's one of the reasons it was so effective or sensible to impose non-pharmaceutical interventions, to impose these physical distancing measures, to postpone the epidemic until such time as a vaccine is available. And implementing that strategy will avoid a lot of death. Anyway, so we happen to be alive, like our ancestors, at a time when this once-in-a-century event was taking place. And from the point of view of the virus, there's a debate in science about whether viruses are living things or not. I'm sort of in the camp that thinks that viruses are living things for various reasons. But regardless of that debate, the virus is acting like any other living thing would act. It is finding untouched terrain and it is exploiting it. Just like if you released, rats onto the island of New Zealand when the Maoris settled New Zealand, 1,000 years ago, they brought rats with them. There had been no rats for 100 million years in New Zealand, and the rats, just took over. Just like that, the virus unleashed into our species, once it escaped immediate control, if it had been possible to immediately control the virus back in November or December in Wuhan, we might have escaped. But once it was on the loose, then, the virus is just going to keep spreading. And that's known in evolutionary biology as an ecological release. Okay, it has new terrain. And our bodies are that terrain for this virus. And as I said, it's going to be with us forever. Now, it's quite a bad pathogen, actually. Now, 10 months in, we know a lot about the virus. It kills between 0.5 and 0.8% of the people who are infected with it. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but that's actually pretty bad. It's not as bad as smallpox. It's not as bad as bubonic plague. It's not as bad as cholera. That's true. But it's much worse than influenza, and it's much worse than chickenpox, and it's much worse than other pathogens. If you get symptoms from the disease, because about half the people do not get symptoms, if you get symptoms from the disease, you have to double the numbers I just gave you, and the so-called case fatality rate is between 1 and 1.6%. So let's say about 1% of people who get this infection and get symptoms from it will die. And of course, as you all know, it varies by age. So young people if they get it, are less likely to die than older people. However, this is less relevant to you in China because you have such low prevalence of the virus. I want to emphasize that does not mean young people should be unconcerned, because death is unlikely in young people from any cause. In other words, it is true that if you're 20 years old and you get the virus, you have a 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 10,000 chance of dying. But if you're 20 years old, you have a very low chance of dying of anything. So actually getting the virus substantially increases your risk of death. So it's not something to joke about. As a parent, I'm very relieved that the virus spares the young. But as a young person, it's still bad to get the virus. Anyway, the mortality of the virus varies by by age. And it's a reasonably deadly virus. About 1% of people who get symptoms from it will die. Another important parameter, which most of you also probably know, is something known as the R naught, the R sub zero. Not N-A-U-G-H-T is the British way of saying zero. And so the term R sub zero is called R naught among epidemiologists, which captures the infectiousness of the virus. This parameter, this is an intrinsic property of the virus, just like the lethality. Just because the virus kills 1% of people, if we take care of them with modern medicine, maybe less than that will die, but the virus still has an intrinsic lethality. There's also, the virus has an intrinsic communicability, and that number, the R naught, is between 2.5 and 3.5, let's say about 3. That means for each case of the virus in a non-immune population of humans that are interacting naturally, each case of the virus would cause 3 new cases. So if you take those, and those are the two basic parameters about the virus. There are many other interesting features. This is a very sneaky virus. It has other interesting features. But if you take those 2 parameters and you plot them on a graph, and you look at all the respiratory pandemics from the last 100 years, the 1918 pandemic, so you have lethality and communicability, the 1918 pandemic would be up here, both the most lethal and the most communicable. The 2009 H1N1 pandemic would be down here. It was a pandemic, but people just got the common cold, so nobody really remembers it. It wasn't very serious. It wasn't deadly. The 1957 pandemic would be in the middle. That was the previous second worst pandemic. It began in Hong Kong, actually in similar circumstances as this one. And it killed about 110,000 Americans, which today would be 220,000 Americans. And I can't remember the numbers, it's in the book, it may have killed 10% of the people in Hong Kong, something like that. That number seems high to me right now, but it was a very serious pandemic. That was 57. This pandemic, the COVID-19, and 57 was the previous second worst pandemic. This pandemic, COVID-19, is the second worst respiratory pandemic we will have had in 100 years. So it's a serious problem. Now, despite the fact that vaccines have been invented and more will be invented, and we're very lucky that they were invented, we are still, in my opinion, at the end of the beginning of this pandemic, not at the beginning of the end. Unfortunately, we still have to endure a fair amount as a global community with respect to this pandemic, because the vaccines, which are being approved right now, and more will be approved, will take time to manufacture hundreds of millions of doses and to distribute. Many of the vaccines require something known as a cold chain. The 2 RNA vaccines need to be held at something like -80 degrees. You need very special freezers from the moment of manufacture to the moment of injection. And many countries don't have that type of a procedure to keep something cold all the time as it moves from place to place. And not only will we have to invent the vaccine, which we've done, we have to manufacture the vaccine, we have to distribute the vaccine, and we have to persuade people to take the vaccine. And so I think that's going to take some time, maybe as long as a year, to get through all of those steps. And we have to get at least 50% of the people vaccinated before we reach something known as herd immunity. Do you guys know what herd immunity is? You probably do. Probably the Chinese newspapers are covering this nonstop. You don't know what herd immunity is. Okay. Herd immunity is a principle from infectious disease, which is the fact that a population of people can be immune to a condition, even if not everyone within the population is immune. For example, consider measles. If you vaccinate 96% of the people for measles, if one of the people you haven't vaccinated gets measles, they really can't spread it to anyone because most of the people they encounter are vaccinated. So it's as if you have 100% of the people being safe, even though you haven't vaccinated 100%. You've just vaccinated 96%. Now, measles is a very infectious disease. And so you have to have a very high, it's in fact, I think the most infectious disease we know, its R naught is between 16 and 18. For every case of measles, you get 16 new cases of measles. It's unbelievable. So you need a very high level. Your intuition should be you need a very high level of vaccination before you prevent outbreaks of measles. That's why the herd immunity threshold is at very high. What's the minimum percentage you need to vaccinate before things can't break out? On the other hand, something like seasonal flu, ordinary flu, its R naught is 1.5. For each case of the flu, you get 1.5 new cases. And that's why you can vaccinate, let's say, 30% of the population, and that's enough to stop an epidemic of the flu. The formula for computing this is R sub 0 minus 1 over R sub 0. You take the infectiousness of the pathogen, you subtract 1, and you divide it by the infectiousness of the pathogen. So if the R naught of coronavirus is 3.0, 3.0 minus 1 is 2, divided by 3 is 66%. That means our herd immunity threshold for coronavirus is 66% of the people would have to be vaccinated. But it turns out that that calculation makes a certain mathematical assumption, which is not quite correct. I won't go into that right now, but it makes an assumption known as the well-mixed assumption. And if you take network science into account, if you take the fact that human populations have a network structure, which is one of the things my laboratory studies, it turns out that number needs to come down, let's say, to about 50%. It's between 40 and probably around 45%, 40 to 50%. Let's use 50%. That means that the herd immunity threshold for this virus is 50% of the people would need to be vaccinated. So to return to where I was before, we have to manufacture, distribute, and get at least half of the population to be vaccinated. Meanwhile, the virus is still spreading. So either way, my feeling is 2022 is a landmark year on the planet. Either we reach herd immunity artificially because we have vaccinated people, or we reach herd immunity naturally because the virus has spread and afflicted half the people. And in fact, you see some places around the world, villages in Austria, cities in Brazil, like Manaus, where they feel like the epidemic has ended. And they feel like, well, maybe not so many people died. But actually, what has happened in those types of situations, you might have a village of 10,000 people, 5,000 have been infected in the village before they reach herd immunity. And of those 5,000, 1%, let's say 50 of them died during the epidemic. And if it's a young village, if the average age of the village is young, maybe it wasn't 50 died, maybe it was 25 died. And maybe they died over the course of 3 or 4 months. So many people might look at that and say, oh, only 25 people died. But that's actually foolish. That's not the right way to see what happened. What happened is an unfettered epidemic ripped through this community and killed whoever it wanted. That's not a success. And you're seeing that in the United States right now, where certain cities in the United States are saying, oh, well, the virus struck us, back in March, and it's behind us now. And it was really bad, but it's over. That is not a victory. That's not a success from a public health point of view, especially if your population is young and you're being deluded into thinking not many people died from that. So there are places around the world, like in Italy, in Wuhan, certainly, the beginning part of the epidemic in China, and in certain parts of Brazil, where the virus just spread and had this impact. And furthermore, as many of you may know, respiratory viruses come in waves. Everybody in epidemiology knows this. There's absolutely nothing surprising about what is happening right now in the United States, that there is a second wave. Incidentally, there will also be a third wave in a year, and probably a fourth wave a year after that, although those waves will have lower amplitude if we invent a vaccine. So there's the first wave of death, then there's a second wave of death when the virus returns the following winter, and how big that wave is can vary. and then a third, and then usually a fourth wave, and then eventually the virus kind of dies down. And this is discussed in chapter 8 of Apollo 0, and we can talk about that if you want to know. But anyway, so we're in the middle of the second wave right now. If your community had reached herd immunity during the first wave, then you might not have such a bad second wave. But that's not because you're lucky. That's not because, oh, you know, the second wave isn't bad. You see some cities in the United States right now saying, second wave isn't so bad. There isn't a second wave. No, the only reason there isn't a second wave is because everyone died the previous wave. It's hardly a victory. So 2022 will mark an important landmark when we reach herd immunity, either artificially or naturally. And then if you look at past pandemics going back hundreds of years, it takes time to recover. So if you look at European accounts, for example, of the bubonic plague, or Native American accounts of cholera outbreaks, for example, after people die in large numbers, it takes a while for society to be returned to normal. And I think that the psychological, social, and economic response or recovery will take a couple of years. So it's not the case that when we reach 2022, everything will return to normal. All the students will go back to sitting in cafeterias and chatting with each other. Business travel will suddenly return to normal and people will happily go to airports. The economy will just bounce back and global supply chains will be restored. No, it will take time for people to recover. People are not instantly going to return. The businesses that have gone out of business are not instantly going to be restored. So I think the intermediate period will last a couple of years, let's say until 2024. And then in 2024, I'm speaking globally, the path in China may be a bit different. I think we're going to have something analogous to the Roaring '20s, which happened after the 1918 pandemic, where people will now relentlessly seek out social interactions. People will be spending their money. During times of plague, people don't spend, but afterwards they spend, and so on. We have these descriptions going back thousands of years of what happens during plague, and the descriptions, for example, during the plague of Justinian in 500 AD, John of Ephesus talks about how everything slowed and ceased. The economy came to a stop. So this is what happens during times of plague. Let me just say a couple more things and then I'll stop talking. We're at 32 minutes after the hour. One of the reasons it's so helpful to study past history as well is that many of the things that strike us as so bad or unusual about coronavirus actually are not that unusual at all. We think what's happening is so alien and so strange, but plagues are not new to our species. Plagues are new to us. We think, oh my God, how can all of this stuff be happening? But it's happened for hundreds of years. And if you read the old accounts, you see, for example, when Wenliang Li, the ophthalmologist who died, who tried to sound the alarm in China, and there was a Communist Party meeting that was happening, I think in this January 12th or something, and it was this news was very inconvenient, and the government didn't want him to talk about what was happening. When Dr. Wenliang Li tried to sound the alarm, people wanted to stop that information. That's not new. People were doing that in Europe 100 years ago. People also did that in the United States. The desire to deny what is happening, denial, is a feature of plagues. People don't like bad news. People don't want to believe that a deadly germ is spreading. This is what happens when deadly germs are spreading. Denial and lies are a feature of plagues. And I don't know if you have this expression in Chinese, but in English, plague is considered one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, plague, death. And if plague is one of the 4 horsemen, one of the great killers, then you can think of denial and lies as being its squire, the man that helps the knight, that's right behind him, So denial and lies are a common feature, and we've seen them around the world in our leaders, in people, in ordinary citizens. People want to deny what's happening. Another thing that's very common is that healthcare workers die. So when the doctors in Wuhan and the nurses started dying, and they did die, just like they've died in the United States or in Iran or in Italy, physicians and nurses around the world have died. Many thousands of them have died taking care of people who are critically sick. And this is awful. And okay, in China, they had no warning when the pandemic struck. But in the rest of the world, why we weren't prepared with more PPE, personal protective equipment, was a big mistake. That our healthcare workers would die because they didn't have the necessary equipment is an awful event. And but if you read Thucydides describing the plague of Athens in 430 BC, Thucydides talks about how the doctors die during plagues. So doctors dying also is not new. Healthcare workers dying during times of plague is an ancient problem. So lies and denial are ancient. Doctors dying is ancient. Sadness and grief are ancient. The fact that people feel sad during times of plague was described by Marcus Aurelius during the plague that afflicted Rome and many other observers. People grieve the loss of life. They grieve the loss of their livelihoods, of their jobs, and they grieve the loss of their way of life, how they're living. This is a very common feature of plagues, and we're seeing it around the world right now. Blaming others and scapegoating, also happening right now. Finger pointing. Who's responsible? Oh, these people are responsible. Those people are responsible. This is stupid. The virus is responsible. It's not any human's fault. It's the virus. And so people during times of plague always want to blame someone else. In Europe, in the bubonic plague, it was the Jews. It must be the Jews' fault. We need to kill them. Or during one of the episodes, there were 4 Spaniards from Spain that happened to be in Italy. And the Italians decided it's the Spaniards' fault. They were put to death, right? During HIV in the United States, it was homosexuals' fault, or people from Haiti's fault, or intravenous drug users' fault. This is all false. This is a lie. It's no one's fault that they're infected with a germ. The germ is what causes the problem. Now, people can behave badly in ways that put themselves and others at greater risk. I'm not saying, for example, we don't need to wear masks, because it's just a virus. People do need to behave responsibly, but the desire to blame other people is a feature of plagues. So let me just stop. Let me just think of some how I will end. What my last thing that I would like to say to you is, I guess I'll just stop by saying that earlier I opened by talking about blueprint, and I talked about how natural selection has shaped us to live in a certain way, to be near each other, to hug and touch each other, to befriend each other, to form groups, to work together, to teach each other things, right? One of the reasons we live socially is so that we can learn from each other. Learning from each other rather than learning on our own. Other animals have to learn on their own. Another animal, for example, if it wants to learn that something is poisonous, it has to eat the poisonous thing and die. And then it learns, oh, that was poisonous. We don't have to do that. I can learn from you. Oh, that's poisonous. Don't eat that. Okay. So we form these groups to get these benefits of friendship and cooperation and teaching and so on. And you could argue, and I have argued, that in a very real way, the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. We come together in order to learn from each other and benefit from interacting with each other, but then we place ourselves at risk for the spread of pathogens. And one of the ironies of this pandemic is that the way we are going to beat the virus is precisely through the spread of ideas. It's by working together and sharing information that actually we will fight back this virus. Using information from the past, using information from each other, working together. This is how we repel an invader like the virus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was fantastic. And I'm sure everybody just wants to get the book now. And hopefully it'll be out in Chinese sooner rather than later. So I'm sure there are lots of questions, very wide-ranging discussion here. So the way we'll do this is people can either type out your questions in the chat box in English or Chinese, we can translate, and we can answer that. Or you can go ahead and directly raise your hand under participants in the bottom of your Zoom function. There's a participants, and you should be able to raise your hand based on that. So go ahead and feel free to ask any questions that you have. And I know it takes a while for people to formulate them and to come up with them. I'll start, I guess, with a question as other people are.
I have to say, someone directly corrected my mentioning of the Maoris. Yes, there's debate about when the Maoris settled New Zealand. Some people think they arrived at 1100 AD. I said 1,000 years ago. Someone said it was only a few hundred years ago. No, approximately 1,000 years ago, they arrived. This is a very smart audience, a very erudite audience. And actually, since that person brought it up, the Maoris brought a Asian rat that was small and not so bad with them. But the Europeans, when they arrived about 200 years ago, brought a bigger Norwegian rat, which was much worse and decimated the population, the animals on the island. Anyway, that's a small footnote. I'm sorry. Go on, Devin. What's your first?
No. That's good. I mean, when we're talking about the scale of the whole world and all of history, what's a couple hundred years?
Yes.
I guess I'll start with a question. It strikes me, and I think many people feel this way, that like the U.S. has been particularly bad
Yes.
at controlling this pandemic. What factors would you say, from a sort of sociological standpoint, are at play there that have kind of that have led to the U.S. being particularly bad at this?
I think honestly, a lot of it was we had the bad luck to have the particular president that we did. I think we had very poor leadership in the White House. Now, in fairness, other European countries like Italy and England also were badly afflicted, but I don't think that gives us a pass. New Zealand did very well. Now, of course, New Zealand is a rich democracy, but it's an island, and you see a lot of islands did well. Taiwan did well. South Korea did well. South Korea is basically an island. I mean, the border with North Korea is sealed. Those countries all did very well. Of course, there are also Asian countries, and there's some sense that there's a lot of theories as to why some of these Asian countries did well. Some have to do with the idea that first of all, they had a lot more experience dealing with these viruses and mobilizing or better prepared. But also there's some biological theories having to do with potentially prior exposure to similar coronaviruses. I don't think that was a big role, but maybe it played a small part. Anyway, but Greece also did well, and New Zealand did well. Greece is not enough. Germany did pretty well at the beginning. So many countries did poorly. Some did well, but that doesn't let the United States off the hook, in my view. In my view, our nation is. I'm very proud of the United States. I think the United States has many wonderful qualities. We have our problems too, but we have many wonderful qualities. And I think we should have done better in dealing with this virus. And we didn't. I think part of it was bad leadership. I think that when the Chinese locked down on January 24th, and we now know that experts in the government knew what was happening, I think what should have been done is we should have immediately begun to prepare the materiel that we needed, the personal protective equipment, the ventilators, certainly all the equipment we should have started manufacturing. The American people should have been prepared. We should have been told, look, this is the threat that's coming. Public messaging should have been better. We should have begun to prepare people for the necessity of wearing masks, for the necessity of physical distancing, and so on. But we didn't do those things. And part of it, we didn't do it as the particular polarization, political polarization we have in our country. And part of it also is that around the world, but including the United States, and this problem afflicts China as well, there's this kind of desire to see difficult problems as black or white, like either it's this way or it's that way. Either you're with me or you're against me. And there's a loss of capacity for nuance. Like any adult knows that the world is complicated. There are shades of gray, right? Things are rarely black or white. But around the world, in many environments, including in the United States, among the American people, there's a desire to see things in this very simplistic way. And I think this makes it very difficult to confront a complex threat where you have to tell people, look, there's no perfect safety and there's no perfect danger. It's shades of risk. And we can take certain actions that are not perfect, but that help us, and they reduce the risk by some amount. And we should do those things, even though they're not going to make you perfectly safe. It's still worth doing those things. It was very hard for people to hear that. You know, for example, they heard that masks were good but not perfect. So some people heard that and said, "Oh, well, we shouldn't wear masks. They don't work." But that's not correct. You know, they don't work perfectly. They work, but not perfectly. You know. Anyway, so I think those were some of the problems that contributed.
Great, thanks. We have a question from Jesse Jiang. Two questions, actually. The first is, how is the coronavirus pandemic remolding the state and citizen relationship, which I think is something that we can talk about very broadly. And then how does the lesson lead us to redefine what a good society may be?
On the latter, I do not think that there's any change in what a good society is. There is a long history of powerful leaders that think that they can reshape society in the way that they think is right. And it always fails, right? You know, a society which tries to tell people that whether people fall in love in their families is not good, or a society that tries to tell people to be suspicious of their friends, for example, doesn't work. Or a society which tries to, well, anyway, it's discussed in Blueprint, this topic. And but many people have tried on the far left and on the far right to, remake society in some new way, and that doesn't work. And I don't think the virus is going to do that either. I think the fundamental way that human beings organize themselves socially will remain unchanged by this pandemic. On the former question, which was a more political question on the relationship between people and the state, I think it depends on how competent the state reaction is. In general, during times of plague, you need state action, right? Like if there's an invader on the frontier and you take your gun and go to the frontier, there's nothing you can do as a solitary individual against the invader. And in fact, even if every citizen takes their gun and goes to the frontier, but in a disorganized way, they're also not going to succeed against the invader. You need organization. You need some kind of way of coordinating the action of people to repel an invader. It's the same with the virus, right? Each of you can take an action to protect yourselves. You can wear a mask, you can stay at home, you can do whatever you want, but that doesn't have any effect on the pandemic. And each of you can also take actions that are disorganized, right? But in a way, if you're disorganized, in the United States, there's a kind of a joke that has circulated about this. If different parts of the country adopt different rules, it doesn't necessarily help us. It's like saying you can pee in this part of the swimming pool and that's okay, and the rest will be fine. But that's not how it works, right? I mean, you can't have like over here we're doing one thing and over there we're doing something else. The virus will spread. So you need coordination. So if the state is able to effectively coordinate people, then I think it will increase confidence in the state. On the other hand, if the state is incompetent, if the state does poorly, I think then the relationship between the citizenry and the state will be worsened. So a pandemic disease is the kind of challenge that calls for collective action and collective response. It is intrinsically a collective threat. An epidemic disease is intrinsically a collective threat, and it requires a collective response. If that response is organized well by the state, then I think it increases confidence in the state. So a lot depends on how it's done. And incidentally, I think this is one of the, well, anyway, you guys can draw conclusions from that statement.
Great, thanks. Tracy has a question, again, a two-parter. Do you think viruses will survive or outlast human beings as they have been in existence for billions of years? And do you think in some way that human beings, after evolving for so many millions of years along with viruses, that we've actually become more vulnerable to them?
Okay, that's a very complicated question. It's discussed in part in chapter 8 of the book. We co-evolved prior to 10,000 years ago. We lived in small groups, and there were probably not pandemics back then. But we co-evolved to live with parasites. So we have a very close relationship with certain parasitic organisms. Most of the viruses and bacteria that cause epidemics, including viruses and bacteria that have become endemic to us, like tuberculosis or measles, for example, or chickenpox. Most of those viruses that we think of as diseases actually have come to us from domesticated animals. So just like coronavirus came from bats and spread to humans and is a new disease to us, all those other diseases that you guys think about also originally came from animals, like HIV came from monkeys, for example, right? Human immunodeficiency virus. All these other things originally came from animals that we domesticated, but we not only had to domesticate these animals and now be in close contact with these animals so that their pathogens could come to us, but we also had to form big enough aggregations. It's called the minimum community size, and it's discussed in the book. It's another epidemiological principle. You see, if let's say you're a group of 100 people and you have a cow, and we think measles originally came from cows about 2,400 years ago to the Romans, all right? If you have 100 people and you have a cow, and we think that the origin of measles is in a similar virus called rinderpest that affects cows, if the virus jumps from the cows to humans, and you're only 100 humans, it infects whoever it's going to infect, and then it runs out of runway, and it auto extinguishes. The virus doesn't have any more people it can infect. It's infected everyone it can infect, and it dies out. So you need 1 million people, like ancient Rome. So the virus can continually circulate in the population. It has to come from the cow and land in a population of a certain minimum size so that it can basically be engrafted into us. So this is called a minimum community size. So the viruses and the bacteria that afflict us came from animals after we domesticated them, most of them, and now live among us because we also live in large aggregations, which is very different than our ancient past prior to 10,000 years ago. Most of the modern pandemics also come from animals, but not our domesticated ones. They come, for example, from bats, which are wild animals. Now, so in some sense, these viruses are unusual to us, but there's no doubt the viruses preceded primates and will be here long after us. So the idea that we will, but we are evolving there to adapt to some of these pathogens. So, for example, there's evidence that Native American populations that were afflicted with smallpox that the European settlers brought, often 95% of the people would die, but the 5% who survived, we now have been shown to have had certain innate genetic features that gave them some immunity. And so therefore the genetic profile of those Native American populations that are still alive is different than it would have been. So that's a kind of, evolution among humans that might happen as asked by your questioner. Did I answer the question? I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, I think that was great. And actually that dovetails pretty well with the next question from Katalia. which is this idea of deglobalization, right? And so, is it because of population size and because of spread, how viruses spread? Is it because globalization that like this pandemic was able to kind of take off in a way that it wouldn't have been able to in the past?
No, I
So
don't think. No, I mean the 1890s so-called Russian flu that began in Uzbekistan, that I think may have been people think it was influenza, but I think it may have been a coronavirus species, and I discussed this in chapter 8 of the book. Took 70 days to get from Moscow to New York. I mean, people always travel. The bubonic plague spread through Europe, on horseback, or as people walked. So I do not think that globalization, I think, has made it a bit faster, but I don't think globalization and the 1918 pandemic, eventually after 30 months, even reached isolated Pacific islands, right? It took almost 3 years to get there, but it got there, right? Even to these very isolated places. So I don't think globalization will do that. I think there is a sense in which the pandemic has made people very sensitive to the global supply chain. And I do think that there will be some unraveling of this. Like, I think countries around the world are realizing that when a global pandemic strikes and trade slows down, that's exactly when you are very vulnerable. If you're dependent on another country to make your essential medicines, and you can't get ships to bring your medicines or factories in that country to make the medicines, that's not a good strategy. So I think there will be some unraveling of the global supply chain, although I think eventually it will return to normal as well, because the economic justification of globalization. And in fact, there's also been some de-urbanization right now. People are fleeing the cities. Even in China, this happened. People went to their ancestral villages, right? This is, again, of hundreds of years, thousands of years. This is what people do in times of plague. They leave the cities and they go to the country. Isaac Newton, left London and invented calculus because he was in the country, okay? This is a very typical thing that's happening. It's happening in the United States right now and around the world, but it will also reverse, I think, because the argument in favor of cities, just like the argument in favor of globalization, is so compelling that I think 5 or 10 years from now, we'll be right back to where we were. I saw that Paris asked a question about whether the virus will prevent the vaccine from spreading. I don't know if she's asking a technical question, which is the vaccine might prevent you from getting sick if you get infected, but it might not stop you from transmitting the disease if you get infected. And we still don't know this well. The AstraZeneca vaccine appears to do that. For the Pfizer and the Moderna, I don't think we know. And for the Sinovac vaccine in China, the attenuated virus, I don't think we know that either. But so the vaccine could prevent you from dying if you get sick, but it might not affect the spreading. That's very possible. And furthermore, just to be clear, Paris, even if we vaccinate everyone, it'll be like measles. That's the best outcome. The virus is still going to be in the world. The virus will still infect people. It will occasionally have outbreaks, but so the virus is not going to be eradicated. And also, I don't think it is, unlike smallpox or polio, which are their global efforts to eradicate those viruses. We know that this coronavirus species can also, for example, live in our dogs and cats, or minks, or other animals. We know from prior examples, like civets and pangolins in China. Some people ask, by the way, why so many of these epidemics start in China. I think pandemics have begun in every continent around the world, so it's not special to China. One of the reasons, of course, is China is huge. So it's, there are very many people in China. So it's not unusual that it would begin there. Also, you have had high density settlements for much longer. So this also makes it easier for pandemics. You've had big cities for a long history. And the culinary practices in China as well may contribute. So the fact that, for example, people eat bats in China, can contribute. So there are a host of factors for that as well. Anyway, the reason I mention that is that if COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 also can live in animals, which it can, then unlike smallpox, which does not live in animals, we will never eradicate a coronavirus. So in answering Paris's question, the virus will still be with us even after we vaccinated large numbers of people.
Okay, last question from May. I know there are a lot of questions, and these are all great questions, but this is all we have time for. So go ahead, May.
Oh, right. Hi, Professor. Thanks for the talk. My question is, do you think that the coronavirus has already evolved since the time we first discovered it?
So there's a lot of debate about that. A month or so ago, I would have said, so generally, the virus has evolved to be milder, right? Like in general, the theory in evolutionary biology is the virus doesn't want to kill us. Killing us is bad from the virus's point of view. What the virus really wants us to do is infect us, make us sick, so we have symptoms like we sneeze, and then we keep moving around and sneeze on other people and give the virus to them. From the virus's point of view, that's the ideal outcome. If the virus infects us and kills us, then we don't spread the virus because we've died. And so that's not good from the point of view of virus. And as mild forms of the virus spread more widely than deadlier forms, people get exposed to the mild form, acquire immunity because they're exposed to the mild form, and therefore are relatively immune to the deadly form. This is very typical. It takes years for that to happen, but that's very typical. Mm-hmm. So people have been monitoring the virus to see, will it evolve to be, but mutation is a chance event, right? There could be a chance event that makes the virus deadlier or more contagious. About up until a month or two ago, there was no evidence that the virus had evolved to be more or less contagious or more or less deadly. But literally in the last month, people are beginning to think that one particular mutation of the virus may make it a bit more contagious. So there's no evidence yet that there are deadlier and less deadly strains. Early on, some people speculated, did the Chinese strain, was it less deadly? And that seeded the Western United States. And the Italian strain was deadlier, killed many Italians, and then came to New York, and that seeded the eastern part of the United States. And the outbreak on the eastern United States was worse than the outbreak on the western. And people were speculating maybe the virus is different. That's not the case. But there is some recent evidence that the virus, a certain strain, may have evolved to be a bit more contagious, yes. But we still don't know for sure yet.
Thank you.
Great. These have been great questions. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for. And thank you, Professor Christakis, for taking the time to deliver such a fascinating talk. My plan is to get all three of your books and to kind of read them all at once so that I can connect all of them. So thank you so much on that. And as you can tell by the questions, people were very much engaged. So that's been fantastic. I will say, for those of you that have questions that didn't get answered, Liu Xin and Francis and everybody else, I will say that actually next week we have Professor Frank Snowden, who is a historian who specializes in the history of epidemics, talking with us. So very much in line with what we talked about today, and probably a little more of the historical examples that we can draw from to talk about modern society and how that's actually been pretty much the same from what I understand. So thank you again. That was fantastic. Hopefully when your book comes out in 10 years, your next book, we'll be able to have another talk. And hopefully sooner, of course, when we can travel again, we'd love to have you visit the center in person.
Thank you so much for having me. And if any of you, I only saw some faces. So if I have former students that are here or collaborators, some of my Chinese co-authors and collaborators, I'm grateful to all of you for your work and contributions. And all of the students that signed in, thank you very much.
Great. And so what I'll do is I'll unmute everybody and have everybody be able to thank you. And if you're willing, please turn on your cameras and we can take a group photo to commemorate at the end. So thank you all, and have a good evening for those of you in China, and a good rest of the day if you're in the US.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye-bye. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.